Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. For over 2 millennia, one name has echoed through the corridors of history, a whisper of a golden age lost to the sea. Atlantis. Was it a real, magnificent civilization swallowed by the ocean in a single, terrible day and night? Or is it merely a cautionary tale, a myth, crafted by the brilliant mind of the philosopher Plato? We journey back in time, sift through ancient texts, and dive into the deepest parts of our oceans, seeking answers to a mystery that has captivated explorers, historians, and dreamers for centuries. This is the search for the truth behind the legend of the lost city of Atlantis. Before the gilded gates of Versailles stood as a monument to absolute power, before the name Marie Antoinette became synonymous with tragic excess, an ancient whisper echoed through the corridors of history, a cautionary tale penned by the philosopher Plato. In his dialogues, the Timaeus and Critias, he recounts the story of a magnificent island civilization, a paradise of wealth and power, named Atlantis. This was not merely a flight of philosophical fancy. It was presented as historical fact, a story passed down through generations, originating from the ancient Egyptians. Plato's account details a land blessed by the gods, a naval superpower whose influence stretched far and wide. Yet this first whisper is not one of glory but of warning. It tells of a society that, over time, allowed its divine nature to be diluted by human greed and arrogance. The story of Atlantis is the archetypal tragedy of a golden age lost, of a people who had everything and, in their hubris, squandered it all. This ancient narrative, of a world consumed by the very sea that once gave it strength, serves as a haunting prelude to our own story. As we delve into the life of the last Queen of France, we must ask, did the court of Versailles become its own kind of Atlantis? Was its intricate etiquette and unimaginable luxury a fortress against reality, just as the fabled city was protected by its rings of water? Plato's account forces us to consider that the patterns of history repeat, that the seeds of self-destruction are often sown in the fertile ground of unchecked power and privilege. The tale of a civilization punished by the gods for its moral decay is a powerful lens through which to view the French monarchy in its final, glittering days. It's a whisper from antiquity, a premonition of the storm that would soon break over France, a storm that would wash away a queen, a king, and an entire way of life, leaving behind a legend as potent and enduring as that of the lost island itself. Plato paints a vivid portrait of the Atlantean capital, a marvel of engineering and social design. It was a city of perfect symmetry, built upon concentric rings of land and sea, interconnected by grand canals and bridges. At its very heart lay a citadel of unimaginable splendor, containing temples sheathed in precious metals and a palace for its royal lineage, descended from the sea god Poseidon himself. This was a utopia made manifest, a self-contained world of order, beauty, and immense wealth, where resources were plentiful and life was governed by wise and just laws. This idyllic image of a flawless, isolated world finds a startling echo centuries later in the Palace of Versailles. While not surrounded by rings of water, Versailles was its own island, a universe unto itself, deliberately set apart from the grit and grime of Paris. Its own concentric rings were not of land, but of protocol, power, and privilege. At its core was the king, and in ever-widening circles of influence radiated the royal family, the high nobility, and the courtiers, each bound by a complex and rigid etiquette. The palace and its sprawling geometric gardens were a portrait of utopia, a demonstration of mankind's ability to impose order and beauty upon nature, a testament to the absolute power of the French crown. For Marie Antoinette, this was the only world she truly knew. Like an Atlantean royal, she lived at the center of this perfect artificial creation. The Hall of Mirrors, the lavish apartments, the private hamlet of the Petit Trianon. These were the temples and palaces of her gilded cage. The city of concentric rings, whether in Plato's myth or in the reality of 18th century France, created a dangerous illusion of perfection and permanence, fostering a profound disconnect from the world that existed beyond its carefully manicured borders. Both were masterpieces of design, but their very perfection made them fragile, their isolation rendering them blind to the rising tides of discontent that would ultimately threaten to engulf them. The inhabitants of Atlantis were not merely wealthy, they were masters of their world, wielding immense power derived from advanced knowledge and divine heritage. Plato describes a civilization with a powerful military, particularly its navy, which held dominion over the seas. They possessed sophisticated engineering skills, capable of building their intricate capital, digging vast canals, and constructing harbors that could hold a massive fleet. Their knowledge of metallurgy allowed them to work with exotic metals, and their system of laws and governance created a stable, formidable empire that expanded its influence across the known world. This portrait of a dominant, seemingly invincible civilization resonates deeply with the status of Ancien Régime France. In the 18th century, France was the undisputed cultural and intellectual capital of Europe. Its power was not necessarily in technology as we know it, but in its absolute command of culture, philosophy, and military might. The French language was the lingua franca of diplomacy and high society. French fashion, dictated by trendsetters like Marie Antoinette, was emulated in every court from St. Petersburg to Madrid. The technology of Versailles was its intricate system of social engineering, the complex web of patronage and etiquette that kept the nobility in check and reinforced the king's absolute authority. This power was rooted in the doctrine of the divine right of kings, a belief as potent and fundamental as the Atlanteans' claim of descent from Poseidon. This immense power, this mastery over its domain, bred a dangerous sense of invulnerability within the French monarchy. They, like the Atlanteans, saw themselves as the center of the universe, the pinnacle of civilization. They believed their system was not only superior, but eternal. This conviction, this unwavering belief in their own supremacy, blinded them to their weaknesses and deafened them to the growing chorus of dissent from a population inspired by the very Enlightenment ideals that French thinkers had championed. Their power had become a prison, isolating them from the reality of their kingdom's true condition. According to Plato's legend, the fall of Atlantis was not a random act of nature, but a punishment for its moral decay. Corrupted by their immense power and insatiable greed, the Atlantean kings embarked on a final, fatal campaign of imperial conquest. They sought to enslave Athens and all of Europe, an act of supreme hubris that defied the will of the gods. In this war, the small but virtuous state of Athens stood alone, successfully repelling the mighty Atlantean forces. But the victory was short-lived. The gods, angered by the Atlanteans' arrogance, unleashed their fury. In a single terrible day and night of violent earthquakes and floods, the island of Atlantis, its people and its entire civilization, were swallowed by the sea, vanishing from the face of the earth. This dramatic downfall serves as a powerful metaphor for the collapse of the French monarchy. The monarchy's war was not against a foreign state like Athens, but against its own people, the Third Estate. Their hubris was not in military conquest, but in their steadfast refusal to acknowledge the legitimate grievances of the populace, the desperate pleas for bread, the demands for political representation, the cries against an unjust tax system. All were dismissed with the arrogance of a ruling class that believed itself untouchable. Marie Antoinette, fairly or not, became the living symbol of this disconnect. Her extravagance, her perceived indifference, and the infamous line, "Let them eat cake," encapsulated the monarchy's fatal pride. The storming of the Bastille was the first great earthquake. The Women's March on Versailles was the flood that breached the palace walls, dragging the royal family back to Paris. The divine punishment was meted out not by gods, but by the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. Just as Atlantis vanished in a single day and night, the French monarchy, an institution that had stood for 1,000 years, was shockingly and violently dismantled, its king and queen consumed by the very revolution their hubris had helped to ignite. Plato's account, as told through the voice of Critias, is both chillingly specific and tragically brief. He speaks of a civilization that had grown arrogant, its divine nature diluted by mortal greed. The gods, led by Zeus, convened to pass judgment upon this fallen empire. Their verdict was absolute. The end did not come through a protracted war or a slow decline. It was swift, total, and terrifying. In the span of a single day and night of misfortune, the world was irrevocably changed. The narrative describes extraordinary earthquakes and floods, a cataclysm of unimaginable scale. The very foundations of the earth seemed to rebel against the hubris of the Atlanteans. We can envision the scene: the magnificent concentric rings of land and water, an architectural marvel being torn asunder. Temples adorned with orichalcum, the mythical red-gold metal, would have crumbled into dust. The advanced canals and bridges, testaments to their engineering prowess, would have been swallowed by violent fissures and the surging, wrathful sea. The island of Atlantis, once the master of a vast maritime empire, disappeared beneath the waves, sinking into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. Plato concludes the passage with a haunting finality. The island vanished, and the site became an impassable barrier of mud and shoal, a navigational hazard that forever marked the grave of a lost world. This was not merely a geological event in Plato's telling, it was a divine punishment. The cataclysm served as the ultimate moral lesson, a stark warning against pride, corruption, and the pursuit of material power over virtue. The story of its destruction became a powerful archetype for the fall of great civilizations, a reminder that even the mightiest can be brought to ruin when they lose their moral compass. The suddenness of the event is what lends it such enduring horror and fascination. An entire continent erased from existence in a mere 24 hours. After Plato laid down his pen, the story of Atlantis did not simply fade into obscurity. Instead, it began a long and complex journey through the intellectual landscape of the ancient world, its meaning debated and reinterpreted by subsequent generations of thinkers. the echo of the sunken city, reverberated through the halls of Plato's own academy. One of the earliest and most significant figures in this transmission was Crantor, a philosopher who lived a generation after Plato. According to the later commentator Proclus, Crantor traveled to Egypt to verify the story's origins. There, he claimed to have seen the tale of Atlantis inscribed in hieroglyphs on ancient columns, just as Plato's source, Solon, had allegedly been told by Egyptian priests. This account, whether factual or not, was crucial. It lent the story an invaluable veneer of historical authenticity, suggesting it was not a mere Platonic invention, but a genuine piece of lost history preserved by an ancient civilization. As the centuries passed, other scholars grappled with the tale. The geographer Strabo, a pragmatist, considered the possibility that land masses could indeed sink and rise, citing geological phenomena to support the idea that Atlantis might have been a real place. However, it was within the mystical and philosophical school of Neoplatonism, which flourished in the later Roman Empire, that Atlantis found its most fertile ground. The philosopher Proclus, writing in the 5th century AD, composed an extensive commentary on Plato's Timaeus. For Proclus and his fellow Neoplatonists, Atlantis was far more than a historical account. It was a profound allegory, a symbolic narrative representing the cosmic struggle between the material and spiritual worlds, between order and chaos. The Athenians represented the ideal ordered state, while the Atlanteans symbolized a powerful but ultimately corrupt material force. Through these interpretations, the story was kept alive, transforming from a political and moral fable into a subject of deep philosophical and historical inquiry that would endure long after the fall of Rome itself. For nearly 1,000 years during the Middle Ages, the legend of Atlantis lay largely dormant, preserved within the quiet confines of monastic libraries, where scribes copied the works of Plato. But as Europe emerged into the light of the Renaissance, a fervent rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman texts brought the tale roaring back to life. The timing of this revival was perfect. It coincided with the dawn of the Age of Discovery, an era defined by a bold and insatiable curiosity to explore the unknown corners of the globe. As navigators like Columbus and Magellan pushed the boundaries of the known world, the idea of a lost continent hidden somewhere in the vast, uncharted Atlantic Ocean suddenly seemed not just plausible, but probable. The myth of Atlantis was no longer a mere philosophical allegory. It became a potential destination. Early cartographers, attempting to map a world that was expanding with each new voyage, sometimes included phantom islands in the Atlantic, speculating that they might be the last remnants of the sunken landmass. The newly discovered Americas, a vast and unexpected new world, became a prime candidate for the location of Atlantis itself. Some scholars and theorists proposed that the indigenous civilizations of Mesoamerica were the descendants of Atlantean refugees, explaining their sophisticated societies and monumental architecture. The legend also captured the imagination of utopian thinkers. The English philosopher Sir Francis Bacon, in his incomplete 1627 novel, New Atlantis, reimagined the myth for a new scientific age. His story described the discovery of a lost, utopian island, Bensalem, whose inhabitants were dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge and the betterment of humanity. Bacon shifted the location to the Pacific, but the inspiration was clear. He had repurposed Plato's cautionary tale into a forward-looking vision of a scientific paradise. Thus, in the Renaissance mind, Atlantis was reborn, transforming from a memory of a fallen world into a symbol of possibility, a lost golden age to be rediscovered, a perfect society to be built anew. The 19th century witnessed a seismic shift in how the Atlantis legend was perceived. It moved decisively from the realm of philosophical speculation and literary fantasy into the burgeoning and often dubious field of pseudo-archaeology. The man almost single-handedly responsible for this transformation was Ignatius Donnelly. A remarkable and multifaceted figure, Donnelly was a U.S. congressman from Minnesota, a populist reformer, and a relentless writer with a flair for the dramatic. In 1882, he published the book that would forever change the conversation, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It was an immediate and international bestseller, not because it was a work of careful scholarship, but because it presented a grand, unified theory of history that was both simple and sensational. Donnelly's central thesis was that Atlantis was not a myth, but a real, historical super-civilization, the very cradle from which all subsequent ancient cultures, Egyptian, Mayan, Hindu, and European, had sprung. He argued that Plato's account was literal history. He then marshaled a staggering array of what he called evidence, drawing parallels between disparate cultures across the globe. Why did both Egyptians and Peruvians mummify their dead? Why were pyramids found on opposite sides of the world? Why did distant mythologies share common flood narratives? For Donnelly, the only logical answer was a common ancestor, Atlantis. He painted a picture of a technologically advanced society that possessed knowledge of gunpowder, advanced metallurgy, and sophisticated agriculture, which was then spread across the world by survivors of the Great Cataclysm. His approach was to gather hundreds of these supposed connections and present them as an irrefutable mountain of proof. In doing so, Donnelly effectively created the genre of modern Atlantology. He stripped the story of its original Platonic context as a moral fable and recast it as the key to a vast historical conspiracy, the lost mother culture that explained all the mysteries of the ancient world. He became the father of the modern Atlantis myth that continues to captivate popular culture to this day. In the twilight of the 19th century, as industrialization churned and scientific materialism seemed to disenchant the world, a powerful countercurrent of spiritualism and esoteric thought began to swell. At its epicenter was a formidable and enigmatic figure, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Through her Theosophical Society, founded in 1875, she presented a sprawling, syncretic cosmology that promised to unveil the primordial wisdom hidden from humanity. Central to this grand narrative were the lost continents of Lemuria and Atlantis, not merely as geographical locations, but as spiritual epochs in the vast evolutionary story of consciousness itself. Blavatsky claimed her magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine, was not her own creation, but a transcription of the stanzas of Dzyan, an ancient text she said was revealed to her by hidden masters in the Himalayas. According to this text, humanity has evolved through a series of root races, each inhabiting its own continental home. The third of these races, the Lemurians, were described as gigantic, ethereal beings, almost mindless in their earliest forms, who lived millions of years ago on a vast continent in the Pacific Ocean. They were said to be hermaphroditic, reproducing by laying eggs, and possessed a form of psychic sight, a third eye, which atrophied as humanity descended into physical matter. This idyllic, spiritual kingdom of Lemuria, however, was doomed. It met its end in a series of cataclysms, sinking beneath the waves due to its inhabitants' slow corruption and fall into physicality. From the survivors of Lemuria arose the fourth root race, the Atlanteans. In Blavatsky's telling, Atlantis was a technological marvel, a civilization of immense power and sophistication that harnessed cosmic energies we can only dream of. But with great power came great hubris. The Atlanteans became masters of black magic, their society descending into decadence, materialism, and conflict. Their moral decay mirrored their continent's fate, which was ultimately destroyed in a final, terrible deluge, a story echoed, she claimed, in the flood myths of cultures worldwide. Our current humanity, the fifth root race, is but a pale reflection of these glorious and tragic predecessors. Blavatsky's tales of Lemuria and Atlantis were more than just fantastical stories. They were a spiritual allegory, a framework for understanding human origins and destiny that resonated deeply with a society hungry for meaning beyond the confines of church and laboratory. The esoteric theories of lost continents, once the domain of mystics and spiritual seekers, were about to be twisted into a tool of unimaginable horror. In the ideological crucible of post-World War I Germany, a fertile ground for radical nationalism and occultism, these myths found a sinister new purpose. The Thule Society, a Munich-based esoteric group, blended Ariosophy, a racist ideology centered on a mythical Aryan race, with legends of a lost northern homeland, Thule or Hyperborea, which they posited as the cradle of this superior civilization. These ideas would seep into the very foundations of the nascent Nazi Party. No one embraced this fusion of myth and racial hatred more fervently than Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsfuhrer of the SS. A man obsessed with creating a new Teutonic aristocracy, Himmler sought to provide the Nazi regime with a hallowed, pseudo-scientific pedigree. He needed to prove that the German people were not just a nation, but the direct descendants of a godlike race that had once ruled the world from a long-lost polar kingdom. To this end, in 1935, he established the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Organization. Functioning as a scholarly branch of the SS, its official mission was to research the anthropological and cultural history of the Germanic race. In reality, it was a state-funded machine for manufacturing history, tasked with scouring the globe for evidence to support their preconceived racial fantasies. Under Himmler's direction, the Ahnenerbe launched expeditions to far-flung locations. They traveled to Tibet in search of the origins of the Aryan race, measuring skulls and documenting local rituals. They explored ancient sites in Scandinavia, searching for runes and relics that could link them to the mythical Hyperboreans. They studied rock art in Italy and sought the Holy Grail in France. Every artifact, every folktale, every piece of archaeological data was filtered through the distorted lens of their ideology. The legend of Atlantis was also co-opted, reimagined as an Aryan colony whose survivors had spread their superior bloodlines across the globe. This was not merely an academic pursuit, it was a core component of the Nazi project. By fabricating a glorious, mythical past, Himmler provided a justification for their horrific vision of the future, a future built on racial purity, territorial expansion, and the extermination of those they deemed inferior. The search for a lost paradise became the blueprint for creating a living hell. While mystics and ideologues looked to prophecy and pseudoscience, A more concrete clue to the Atlantis legend lay buried for millennia beneath the Aegean Sea. Our story shifts from the realm of the occult to the world of archaeology and volcanology, to the stunning Greek island of Santorini, known in antiquity as Thera. Around 3,600 years ago, during the height of the Bronze Age, Thera was not the crescent-shaped archipelago we see today, but a single, large island. It was a vital outpost of the magnificent Minoan civilization, a sophisticated culture centered on the nearby island of Crete, renowned for its art, maritime trade, and grand palaces. On Thera, the city of Akrotiri was a flourishing port, its multi-story houses adorned with vibrant frescoes depicting scenes of daily life, naval processions, and exotic landscapes. But this prosperous world existed in the shadow of a sleeping giant. The island of Thera was, in fact, a massive volcano. Sometime around 1600 BCE, it awoke in one of the most violent eruptions in recorded human history. The cataclysm was almost unimaginable. It exploded with a force hundreds of times greater than the atomic bomb at Hiroshima, spewing a colossal plume of ash and rock miles into the stratosphere. The heart of the island collapsed into the sea, forming the vast, water-filled caldera that gives Santorini its iconic shape today. Pyroclastic flows incinerated everything in their path, and the collapse of the magma chamber triggered colossal tsunamis that radiated across the Aegean, devastating the coastlines of Crete and other islands, crippling the Minoan civilization from which it would never fully recover. The city of Akrotiri was entombed in a thick blanket of volcanic ash, preserving it perfectly, a Bronze Age Pompeii. It is this real historical catastrophe that many scholars now believe was the seed of Plato's Atlantis story. The parallels are striking. Plato described Atlantis as a powerful island civilization destroyed in a single day and night of misfortune. The Minoans were a formidable naval power. The circular shape of the caldera mirrors Plato's description of Atlantis's concentric rings of land and water. The timeline, though not exact, places the eruption within a plausible time frame for a story to be passed down through generations until it reached the Athenian philosopher. While the Thera hypothesis doesn't account for all of Plato's details, it provides a compelling, tangible anchor for the myth, grounding the legend of a lost world in the very real fury of our planet. In the late 1960s, the search for Atlantis took a dramatic turn, moving from ancient texts and volcanic islands to the shallow, crystalline waters of the Caribbean. In 1968, off the coast of North Bimini Island in the Bahamas, divers discovered something that seemed to defy natural explanation: a submerged, linear formation of enormous, flat-topped stones, stretching for nearly half a mile. To the untrained eye, it looked unmistakably man-made. A massive pavement, a harbor wall, or perhaps a road leading to a city now lost beneath the waves. It was immediately dubbed the Bimini Road. The discovery electrified the public, not least because it seemed to be a direct fulfillment of a prophecy. Edgar Cayce, the famed American psychic, known as the Sleeping Prophet, had predicted decades earlier that evidence of Atlantis would rise from the sea near Bimini in 68 or 69. For believers, this was no mere coincidence. It was proof. The Bimini Road became the prime candidate for a genuine remnant of the lost continent, a tangible link to a forgotten world. Divers and amateur researchers flocked to the site, claiming to find further evidence of human craftsmanship. They pointed to what looked like tool marks on the stones, a multi-layered construction in some areas, and smaller prop stones seemingly placed intentionally to support the larger blocks. The narrative was tantalizing. This was not just a road, but a sacred processional way from an Atlantean temple. However, when geologists and marine archaeologists arrived to conduct formal studies, they proposed a far less sensational explanation. They identified the formation as a classic example of beach rock. This is a type of sedimentary rock that forms rapidly in the intertidal zone when sand and shells are cemented together by calcium carbonate. A key characteristic of beach rock is that it naturally fractures into straight, geometric lines and large rectangular blocks, creating patterns that can look deceptively artificial. The scientists argued that the tool marks were simply erosion patterns. The multi-layered structure was a result of sequential fracturing, and the prop stones were just smaller pieces that had broken off and settled underneath. Thus began a debate that continues to this day. On one side are the geologists and archaeologists who maintain that the Bimini Road is a fascinating but entirely natural geological feature. On the other are the believers who insist that its precision, scale, and alignment with Casey's prophecy are evidence of intelligent design. The Bimini Road remains an enigma, a place where the line between science and myth blurs, a submerged pathway that leads either to a lost civilization or simply to the elegant, ordered chaos of the natural world. In the vast, unforgiving desert of public opinion, Marie Antoinette found herself at the center of an inescapable formation of scrutiny and scorn. Like the enigmatic Richat structure, a giant eye staring from the earth, the gaze of France was fixed upon her, dissecting her every move. From the moment she crossed the border as a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess, she was no longer a person but a public spectacle, a symbol upon whom an entire nation's anxieties were projected. At Versailles, privacy was a foreign concept. The rituals of the court were designed for observation. The queen's waking, her dressing, her dining, all were performances for a select audience of aristocrats. But beyond the palace walls, a far larger and more hostile audience was gathering. Her every choice was interpreted through a lens of suspicion. Her preference for simpler gowns was not seen as a move away from stifling formality, but as a rejection of French silk weavers and a threat to the national economy. Her deep friendships with women like the Princesse de Lamballe and the Duchesse de Polignac were twisted in libelous pamphlets, or libelles, into lurid tales of debauchery and lesbianism. These crude publications, passed from hand to hand in the back alleys of Paris, constructed a monstrous theory of the Queen. They painted her as a foreign agent, the head of an Austrian committee plotting France's ruin, and as a hedonist whose lavish spending was draining the treasury, a narrative that ignored the nation's far deeper financial woes, stemming from wars and an unjust tax system. This was the structure of her public damnation, concentric rings of lies built around a kernel of truth, her foreign birth and her discomfort with court etiquette. Each ring reinforced the next, from whispers in the corridors of power to pornographic cartoons sold on the Pont Neuf. She was trapped in the center of this eye, a perfectly formed circle of condemnation from which escape was impossible. Every attempt to appear relatable or to escape the public gaze, such as her retreat to the Petit Trianon, only tightened the circle, feeding the theory that she was aloof, arrogant, and utterly contemptuous of the people she was meant to rule. As the years passed, the initial warmth that greeted the young Dauphine gave way to a deep and unforgiving frost. Marie Antoinette found herself living under the ice of public opinion, a vast, frozen continent of hostility and suspicion. The core of this chilling isolation was the Antarctica hypothesis of her day, the pervasive and unshakable belief that she was not French, but fundamentally and treacherously Austrian. L'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, was the epithet hurled at her, a constant reminder of her foreignness. This wasn't merely a statement of fact, it was an accusation. It implied a cold, alien nature, a heart that could not possibly beat in time with France's. For 7 long years, the royal marriage produced no heir, and this failure became a national crisis. The blame was laid squarely at her feet. Rumors, as cold and sharp as ice shards, suggested she was barren, or worse, that she engaged in affairs to spite her impotent husband. When she finally did give birth, the whispers didn't cease. They simply shifted, questioning the children's paternity. This relentless campaign of slander froze her out of the nation's heart. In response, she retreated further, seeking warmth in her private circle and in the idyllic fantasy of her hamlet, the Hameau de la Reine. But this escape was seen as the ultimate proof of the hypothesis. Her private world was interpreted as a cold rejection of France. Building a rustic village while peasants starved was seen not as a pastoral escape, but as an obscene mockery of their suffering. She was isolated, encased in a glacier of resentment. Even at court, factions plotted against her, viewing her influence over the well-meaning but indecisive Louis XVI as a foreign contamination. Every piece of political advice she offered, often at the king's request, was framed as an order from her brother, the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna. She was a woman stranded in a polar landscape of her own court, surrounded by a populace that saw her as a creature from a distant, hostile land, incapable of warmth, loyalty, or love for France. If one event could be said to have mapped the depths of hatred for Marie Antoinette, it was the affair of the diamond necklace. It was a scandal so convoluted, so audacious, that untangling it required a kind of forensic exploration into the darkest abysses of ambition and deceit. The Queen was not a conspirator in this affair. She was its primary victim. Yet, in the court of public opinion, she was its villain. The plot was masterminded by an impoverished aristocrat, Jean de la Motte, who saw a path to riches through the vanity of Cardinal de Rohan, a man desperate to regain the Queen's favor. Using forged letters, Jean convinced Rohan that Marie Antoinette secretly lusted after a diamond necklace of astronomical value, a piece so expensive the king himself had deemed it an extravagance too far. Jean arranged a clandestine meeting in the gardens of Versailles between Rohan and a prostitute disguised as the Queen, cementing the cardinal's belief. Convinced he was acting on the Queen's secret command, Rohan acquired the necklace on credit and gave it to Jean to pass along. Of course, Jean's husband promptly disappeared to London to break up the necklace and sell the diamonds. When the jeweler's bill came due and the scheme imploded, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette made a fatal error. Confident in her innocence, the Queen pushed for a public trial, believing this modern exploration of the facts would act like sonar, pinging through the murky depths and revealing the truth to all of France. Instead, the trial mapped the public's profound willingness to believe anything of their Queen. The proceedings became a sensation, and Jean de la Motte, a charismatic liar, became a folk hero. The Cardinal de Rohan, was ultimately acquitted, a verdict that implied the Queen could very well have been involved in such a sordid transaction. The scandal's fallout was like a satellite image, revealing the full, horrifying landscape of her unpopularity. She had been publicly humiliated, her name irrevocably linked to corruption and deceit. The affair proved that the truth no longer mattered. The narrative of the wicked queen was now set in stone. By the late 1780s, the tremors of discontent had become a full-blown earthquake. The very foundations of France were cracking, and a geological verdict was about to be rendered on 1,000 years of monarchy. For Marie Antoinette, this was not a political debate. It was the ground disappearing beneath her feet. The continent of the Ancien Régime, with its bedrock of divine right and aristocratic privilege, was violently shifting. The rising sea level of popular fury, fueled by famine, debt, and radical new ideas of liberty, was poised to drown the world she had always known. The first great shockwave was the Women's March on Versailles in October 1789. A furious mob, 1,000 strong, marched from Paris, demanding bread and justice. They breached the palace gates, a terrifying inundation of the sacred royal space. The royal family was forced to relocate to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, becoming virtual prisoners of the revolution. The shift was complete. The center of power was no longer the opulent court of Versailles, but the volatile streets of the capital. Trapped, the royal family saw only one way out: escape. The flight to Varennes in June 1791 was their desperate attempt to reach Loyalist territory. But it was a catastrophic failure. Recognized and captured just miles from the border, they were escorted back to Paris, not as monarchs, but as traitors. This failed escape delivered the final geological verdict. It shattered the fiction of a constitutional monarchy and proved to the people that the king and queen were actively conspiring against the new France. The continent of monarchy was sinking fast, and the republic was rising to take its place. Marie Antoinette, once the glittering symbol of royal authority, now saw the abyss opening before her. The sea of revolution was unforgiving, and it was now clear that the tide was not just washing away her power and privilege, but was rising to claim her very life and the lives of her family. The old world was gone, submerged by a wave of change that was as unstoppable as the movement of the earth itself. The search for the true Marie Antoinette is a journey through a hall of mirrors, where truth is distorted by deliberate deception. No event better exemplifies this than the affair that sealed her public doom: the affair of the diamond necklace. It was a scandal in which she was entirely innocent, yet it became the cornerstone of the case against her in the court of public opinion. The story is a masterclass in manipulation, starring a cast of characters driven by greed and ambition. At its center was Jeanne de Valois-Saint-Remy, a descendant of a former French king, a grifter with an insatiable desire for wealth and status. She saw her opportunity in the Cardinal de Rohan, a man desperate to regain the Queen's favor. The final piece was a necklace of staggering opulence, a 2,800-carat monstrosity, commissioned by Louis XV for his mistress, which his successor, Louis XVI, had refused to purchase for Marie Antoinette due to its exorbitant cost. Jeanne constructed an elaborate lie, convincing the cardinal that the Queen secretly coveted the necklace and wanted him to act as her discreet intermediary. To sell the fraud, she forged letters in the Queen's hand and even staged a moonlit meeting in the gardens of Versailles. hiring a prostitute who bore a passing resemblance to the queen to murmur a few words of encouragement to the gullible cardinal. Convinced he was now in the queen's confidence, Rohan acquired the necklace on credit, handing it over to Jeanne's accomplices, who promptly disappeared to London to break it apart and sell the diamonds. When the first payment came due and Rohan could not pay, the jewelers went directly to the queen, who was utterly bewildered. The king, furious at the slight to his wife's name, made a fatal error. He had the cardinal arrested publicly. The ensuing trial became a public spectacle. Rohan was ultimately acquitted, portrayed as an innocent dupe, which implicitly suggested that the queen must have been involved. Jeanne was convicted, but her sensational fabricated memoirs from prison, detailing a sordid affair with the queen, became bestsellers. For a public already steeped in slanderous pamphlets against the Austrian, the story was too perfect. The hoax cemented Marie Antoinette's image as Madame Deficit, a reckless spendthrift, willing to bankrupt the nation for a bauble, even when she had rejected it. The deception clouded all search for truth, leaving only the intoxicating lie. Long before she faced a tribunal, Marie Antoinette was tried and convicted by a narrative. Her life story was systematically reshaped into a moral allegory, a cautionary tale designed not to reflect reality, but to justify a revolution. The true intent of her detractors was to forge a symbol of everything corrupt about the Ancien Regime, and she was the perfect, foreign-born anvil upon which to hammer out their political message. From the moment she arrived in France as a 14-year-old archduchess, she was l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, an outsider who could never be truly French. This seed of otherness was cultivated by her enemies into a tree of treason. The primary tools of this character assassination were the libelles, slanderous, often pornographic pamphlets that depicted the queen as a sexually insatiable deviant, a manipulative spy, and a heartless monster. These documents, devoid of truth, were the 18th century equivalent of viral disinformation, spreading through Paris and poisoning the public consciousness. The most enduring fabrication, of course, is the phrase, "Let them eat cake." In a single sentence, it captured the essence of the allegory. A queen so detached from the suffering of her starving people that she offers a flippant, impossible solution. Historians agree she almost certainly never said it. Variations of the line had been attributed to other royal figures for decades. But the truth was irrelevant. The line was a weapon, perfectly crafted to distill complex socio-economic problems into a simple, memorable narrative of aristocratic cruelty versus popular suffering. By making her the villain, revolutionaries could channel public rage. She became the scapegoat for centuries of systemic inequality, failed harvests, and national debt. Every critique of the monarchy, its extravagance, its isolation, its perceived weakness, was projected onto her. The intent was clear: to dehumanize her completely, transforming a flawed but complex woman into a two-dimensional caricature. She was no longer a person, but a moral lesson, an allegory for a rotten system that had to be torn down, and her death was presented as its necessary symbolic conclusion. The opulent, lost world of Versailles has become a modern Atlantis, a mythologized kingdom submerged by the tides of history, and its last queen, Marie Antoinette, remains its most captivating icon. Her cultural footprint is immense, not because of her political achievements, but because her life story serves as a perfect canvas for our own projections about celebrity, youth, femininity, and tragedy. In cinema, her portrayal has evolved dramatically, reflecting the changing values of the eras producing them. The grand historical epics of the mid-20th century often depicted her as a haughty, foolish queen, a villainess deserving of her fate. But in 2006, Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette radically reframed her for a new generation. With a post-punk soundtrack, candy-colored visuals, and a focus on her teenage isolation, Coppola transformed the doomed queen into a sympathetic, misunderstood adolescent, trapped in a gilded cage. This interpretation, while historically debatable, resonated deeply, recasting her not as a political monster, but as a victim of circumstance, a proto-celebrity crushed by the pressures of fame. Literature, too, has endlessly explored her psyche. Stefan Zweig's classic biography painted a deeply psychological portrait of her transformation, from a flighty girl to a figure of immense dignity in the face of death. Historical fiction novels continue to imagine her inner world, her friendships, her fears, and her passions, attempting to give voice to the woman silenced by propaganda and the guillotine. Beyond film and books, her aesthetic continues to define a certain kind of lavish, romantic, and rebellious femininity. The towering poof hairstyles, the decadent silks, and the rustic fantasy of her private hamlet, the hameau de la reine, are endlessly referenced by fashion designers, artists, and photographers. She has become a perennial mood board for luxury, excess, and doomed glamour. This enduring cultural footprint exists because her story is so malleable. It can be a tale of injustice, a warning about excess, a feminist tragedy, or a rock and roll rebellion. She is no longer just a historical figure. She is an archetype, a ghost of glamour and gore, who continues to haunt our collective imagination. The search for Atlantis is a quest for a lost world, but the unquenchable quest for Marie Antoinette is a search for a lost person. For over 2 centuries, we have been sifting through the wreckage of her life, trying to excavate the real woman from beneath layers of myth, propaganda, and political expediency. This is the enduring work of historians, biographers, and a public that remains deeply fascinated by her tragic story. Why do we still search? Because the caricature created by her enemies is profoundly unsatisfying. The one-dimensional monster of the pamphlets cannot account for the dignity she displayed during her trial, the courage she showed on her way to the scaffold, or the heart-wrenching love for her children evident in her final letter. The quest for the real Marie Antoinette is a quest to reconcile these contradictions. The primary tools in this search are her own words. Her vast correspondence, particularly her letters to her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, and to her close friends, reveals a voice starkly different from her public image. Here we find not a calculating political mastermind, but a young woman often overwhelmed by the rigid etiquette of the French court, homesick and politically naive. We see her anxieties, her small joys, her evolving love for her husband, and her fierce devotion as a mother. These documents are the closest we can get to her truth, providing a powerful counter-narrative to the lies that condemned her. This search is also fueled by a modern sense of injustice. We see in her a story of how a woman's reputation can be systematically destroyed, how public opinion can be manipulated, and how a political system can sacrifice an individual for its own survival. Her trial was a sham, its verdict predetermined. We search for her truth because we instinctively recognize the profound injustice of her end. We are not looking to absolve her of her flaws, Her extravagance and political missteps were real, but the unquenchable quest is about restoring her humanity. It is the desire to look past the diamonds and the cake, to push aside the revolutionary slander, and to understand the journey of the 14-year-old girl who became a queen, a prisoner, and finally, a tragic symbol on the long and bloody road to the guillotine.